Okay, so let's say you have some kind of letter that you want to deliver, right? So you have a letter that's in your mailbox, and let's say that this is the sender of the letter, right? And so the sender of that letter is going to deliver that mail all the way over here to the recipient, right? And the way that they're going to do that is you're going to have this mailman in this truck deliver it from the sender to the recipient, and they're going to drive along this road. But then let's say something happens. Let's say for some reason an earthquake happens, right? And the earthquake actually destroys the road over here. And so now the mailman can't really get to where they need to go anymore, right? Because the road has been damaged. So why am I giving this extremely hypothetical scenario? Well, I think that it serves as a pretty good analogy towards understanding a disease called multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis is a disease of the brain, and more specifically, it affects the communication within the brain. So what do I mean by communication in the brain? Well, in the brain, you have all these neurons, right? You have all these neurons that are constantly talking to each other, kind of like these two neurons over here. And so this neuron is going to send an electrical signal down the length of the axon, and that electrical signal is in the form of an action potential. And so to improve the efficiency of the communication, you have this stuff that kind of insulates the axon. So this stuff that I've drawn here in red is called myelin, and it really just makes the action potential move down the axon much more quickly. So we can actually kind of compare this two-way communication system, right, with our mailman. So, we have kind of the sender of the message, that would be the first neuron. We have the message, that would be kind of like the action potential. We have the road, which would be, the myelin and the axon together. And we have the recipient. Now, in our analogy, we had an earthquake that actually destroyed the road somehow. So in multiple sclerosis, what happens is you get destruction of the road, and more specifically, you get a degradation of the myelin. And so because there's degradation of the myelin, we can call multiple sclerosis a demyelinating disease. So this is really where that disruption in the communication goes on, right? And when the myelin is degraded, the action potential won't really travel down the axon as quickly anymore. And sometimes it may not even travel down to begin with. So what's causing that degradation? Well, as it turns out, in multiple sclerosis, the immune system actually sneaks its way into the brain. And when the immune system sneaks its way into the brain, for some reason it mistakenly recognizes that myelin, right, this myelin over here, as foreign. And when it mistakenly recognizes it as foreign, it starts to attack the myelin, hence this degradation. And because the immune system is attacking the body itself, we call multiple sclerosis an autoimmune disease as well. So that's kind of a cellular perspective on multiple sclerosis. But now I kind of want to give you a more macroscopic perspective on what the disease does to the brain, right? So let me clear up some space over here. And let me actually show you now two different brains. So this is just really a brain scan, or two different brain scans of, two different brains. So on the left, we have a perfectly healthy brain. And on the right, we have the brain of someone who's suffering from multiple sclerosis. Immediately on the right brain, you can tell that you have these bright spots over here, right, called plaques. So plaque is also really referred to as a lesion. And a lesion is really just a piece of tissue that's been damaged. So let's say, for example, you have a hand over here. Maybe you get a cut on your hand somehow, right? You can call that cut kind of a lesion of the skin. In multiple sclerosis, you have a lesion in the brain, right? And those lesions are really coming from the damaged myelin, from the immune system. So what happens is you have all these immune cells that kind of come together, right? They kind of cluster around certain parts of the brain, and they attack it. And when you have a whole bunch of immune cells coming together to attack a certain part of the body, we call this inflammation. And because it's happening in the brain, we call it Neuro Inflammation. Now, the condition in which you have these lesions in the brain is called sclerosis. In the case of multiple sclerosis, you have multiple lesions, hence why we call it multiple sclerosis. Now notice how you're getting these lesions in different parts of the brain, okay? Different parts of the brain are going to be responsible for different functions. Some may be responsible for vision, others may be responsible for cognition, for moving around, for movement, for touch, and so on and so forth. And depending on where these lesions form in the brain, you can get a variety of different symptoms that can affect all of these functions. Now, why do these lesions form? Why does the immune system attack the brain? The problem is that we don't actually know. We're not really sure with 100% certainty what causes multiple sclerosis. All we know is that some people may have a kind of genetic predisposition towards developing the disease, and that there are also probably some environmental factors that may be involved as well. And the fact of the matter is that your genetics can really interact with the environment, and that can kind of stimulate the progression of the disease. Now, the exact types of genes that are involved and the exact types of environmental factors that may be involved will be a topic that I'll cover in a later video. But for now, this is really all that we know about the causes of multiple sclerosis. Now, even though we don't really know perfectly what causes multiple sclerosis, we do know who is more likely to develop the disease. So I'm going to actually clear up some more space here again. And so now I'm going to show you a picture of the Earth. And the reason is because I want to give you a global perspective on the prevalence and the incidence of multiple sclerosis. So the disease affects about 2.5 million people worldwide. Now, is everyone on the planet equally likely to develop the disease? Well, no. As it turns out, if you move north from the equator, right, so if you move north from here, you'll notice that the incidence of MS actually increases. And the incidence is actually pretty high, in these northern areas, right? So like here in Canada and in the northern United States, and here in a lot of Europe and Russia as well. So it often affects Caucasians more than other races. And more specifically, among the Caucasians, it affects people of Northern European descent more often. The disease is also more common in women than it is in men, right? And it's thought that of the 2.5 million people worldwide, about 2/3 of them are women, so 66% of them are women. So what age do people start to develop MS? It's usually in the age range of 20 to 50 years old. And it's usually on the earlier end of that spectrum. And lastly, one thing that I really want to emphasize is that the disease itself is not fatal. So the disease itself won't actually kill you, right? But the life expectancy is a bit lower. And it's thought to be lowered by about, a few months to a few years. Now, even though it's not fatal, the disease itself is quite debilitating, and it can really affect the person's lifestyle through a number of different signs and symptoms. And that'll be a topic. So here we have the brain of someone who's suffering from multiple sclerosis. And you'll notice that there are these bright spots that are kind of located throughout the brain, known as plaques. These plaques are also referred to as lesions. And a lesion is really just a piece of damaged tissue. Now note how these plaques are forming in different parts of the brain. So the really important thing to keep in mind is that different parts of the brain will be responsible for different functions. So some parts may be involved in vision, movement, touch, cognition, and even emotion. So you can get a dysfunction in each of these categories depending on where the lesion forms. So for example, if you have a lesion that forms in parts that are responsible for vision or for seeing, then you won't really be able to see as well. So as it turns out, visual symptoms are actually among the first symptoms that people usually experience in MS, so I'm going to be talking about those first. So I'm going to show you here a picture of the eye, right? And so at the back of the eye, you have this structure over here called the optic nerve. And the optic nerve really just carries all the visual information picked up from the eye to the rest of the brain. And as it turns out, it's actually a pretty common site for lesion formation. So let's say we have a lesion that, maybe it forms around here. So if you get lesions in the optic nerve, then you can imagine that there will be a lot of problems with vision. Now, it's not as severe as total blindness, but in general, your vision is impaired. So let's say, you go to the eye doctor. They're going to ask you to read off of a series of letters on a screen across the board. So your ability to read off of the smallest letters will be pretty badly impaired, right? So you won't really be able to see these letters as well anymore. In addition to that, colors also appear a little bit washed out. So let's say, when you have normal, healthy color vision, this is you're looking at this green box, and it looks like this, right? But if you have multiple sclerosis, the green box may actually look a little bit more washed out. So maybe something like this, right? It's not as clear, or not as distinct, I should say. So, in addition to, this impaired vision and this washed out color vision, people will also just experience general pain. So whenever they move their eyes around, it kind of hurts a little bit. So those are some of the major visual symptoms that people feel when they get lesions in the optic nerve. But there are other parts of the brain where people may experience, where if you get lesions there, then people may experience other visual problems as well. So I kind of have this green nerve coming out, right, from somewhere, and it's innervating the muscles of the eye, right? So this nerve will be responsible for moving the eye around. Now, where does that nerve come from? It comes from a part of the brain known as the brainstem. And really, there are more nerves that come out, but this is just to simplify our understanding of it. Now, in the brainstem, you have these cell bodies, right? So these cell bodies are going to project their axons into these nerves, right? And then these nerves will ultimately innervate the muscles of the eye. And as it turns out, this is actually a pretty common site of lesion formation, this general area of the brainstem, or at least where the axons are in that region of the brainstem. So you can imagine that you'll get a lot of problems with moving your eye around. So if you ever look at the eyes of a person with MS, what you'll notice is that they look like they're vibrating a little bit. So sometimes, they may have a vibration motion, horizontally or even vertically as well. In addition to that, if you kind of show a yellow bar of light, maybe, it could be any image, but let's say we have a yellow bar of light. If you show this, they may report seeing kind of a second yellow bar of light right next to it. So they're experiencing this double vision effect. And the reason is because, their eyes aren't really moving in unison anymore. So because they're not moving in a coordinated fashion, the images that they receive, they're not really able to converge those images that they receive. So because of that, you kind of see this double vision. You see two of one object. So the brainstem isn't really just going to innervate the eye, right? It can innervate other parts of the body as well. So let me clear up some space here. And as it turns out, the brainstem also is going to innervate a part of the body simply known as your throat. So you have a whole bunch of muscles in your throat, and the muscles in your throat are going to be doing a whole bunch of different things. So some really important functions would just be, like talking and swallowing food. So if you get lesions in the brainstem, maybe you have some lesions that form over here, right? Then you can have problems doing just that. A lot of people with MS, they may kind of, they may stutter a little bit. They may not really talk as well as they used to. And they may also kind of have difficulty in swallowing their food. It becomes much more painful and much more difficult to do just that. So now I kind of want to show you symptoms that are associated with lesions in another part of the central nervous system. So let me actually just clear up a little bit of space here again. So now I'm kind of showing you the picture of a brain of someone who's kind of facing towards you. And down here we have a picture of the spinal cord, right? And this is really just a segment of that spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to be responsible for connecting the brain with the rest of the body. So it kind of transmits information about both touch and motor control between the brain and the rest of the body. So let's say, you have some kind of nerve fiber ending over here, right? And this nerve fiber ending is basically going to transmit the information about touch to the spinal cord. And then from the spinal cord, that information is just going to be taken up to the rest of the brain. So maybe, you have some more nerves that go up from the spinal cord and then into the brain, right? And here it's just later processed. So of course this is a very simplified schematic, but in general, if you get lesions in this area, maybe you get some kind of lesion over here or maybe one over here, then you can get a lot of problems with touch. So one pretty common symptom that people might feel is numbness. In addition to that, people may have the sensation of pins and needles kind of prickling into their skin. And this is really just the equivalent of, your limbs falling asleep. And we typically call this paresthesia. And then finally, people may just experience, plain old pain. If they ever, sometimes if you look down or you look forward, then the person may kind of feel the sensation of like an electric shock kind of moving down their spinal cord and then radiating into the rest of their limbs. So it's not just touch information that's transmitted between the body and the brain. It's also motor information. So motor information can, it can move down from the brain into the spinal cord. And then from the spinal cord, that information can contact another set of nerves that'll innervate the muscles of your hand. And if you get lesions in these areas, you're going to get some problems with motor control. So for example, a lot of people may experience paralysis. They may not be able to use their legs to move around, so that renders a lot of people incapable of walking. So they need to use wheelchairs and canes to move around. On the flip side of paralysis, they may experience spasticity. And in spasticity, their muscles are too stiff, they're too overactive, and because they're too stiff, they become very tense. It's as if the muscles are just constantly contracting for some reason, and because they're constantly contracting, this can lead to quite a bit of pain in those muscles. In addition to that, people may also experience problems with bladder and bowel controls. So they may, maybe they're urinating too frequently, or maybe they're finding difficulty in urinating. There's a problem in the control of the bladder, and there's also a problem with the control of the bowel movements, right? And then finally, people may experience sexual dysfunction. So oftentimes a lot of people have problems in initiating or maintaining arousal, right? They may also have problems in achieving an orgasm. So next, let's turn this brain around and let's talk a little bit more about some of the cognitive symptoms that people experience in MS. So now our brain is kind of looking to the right, and you'll see that I've kind of already shaded in a part of the brain, and this part of the brain is simply known as the frontal lobe. So what does the frontal lobe do? Well, it's responsible for cognition. So what are some cognitive behaviors? Well, there's attention, working memory, thinking, and decision-making. So if you get lesions in the frontal lobe, then you can experience a lot of problems in all these cognitive functions. So for example, a lot of people may experience problems with paying attention to things. They may also be a little bit more forgetful. They may have problems thinking about and understanding certain concepts, and subsequently their ability to kind of solve problems is pretty heavily impaired. And finally, they may also be a little bit indecisive as well. So multiple sclerosis is a disease of the brain where the immune system kind of comes in and attacks the brain at where the myelin is, thereby disrupting all the communication that happens in the brain. Now, is the immune system always just going to be in the brain, just chipping away? Well, not always, right? The way that the immune system kind of comes and goes and the way that the brain accumulates all this damage varies from person to person. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the clinical course of multiple sclerosis. And by clinical course, I mean how does the disease progress? How does it get worse? Does it ever improve? Or when do the symptoms show up? How often do the symptoms show up? There are really 4 different types of MS, and each type is characterized by its own unique clinical course. So here I'm showing a graph, and on the x-axis is going to be time, right? And this will be over the course of the entire person's lifespan. And on the y-axis, we're just going to be looking at the severity of the disease. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of trace the clinical course of each type of multiple sclerosis using this graph. So the first type of multiple sclerosis that I'm going to talk about is called relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis. So let's say all of a sudden there's a huge flare-up of inflammation in the brain. Okay, let's say all of a sudden a lot of immune cells come in and they all begin to attack the brain collectively. So when this happens, the brain will start to accumulate damage and the severity of the disease will increase over time. And so then what happens is the immune system actually kind of stops attacking the brain and it stops damaging all that myelin so much. And so then this leaves the brain with the ability to kind of just repair all that myelin. Right? So the brain can actually repair itself to a limited degree. Now, it's not really able to repair all the way, so, the severity of the disease kind of doesn't really go all the way down to 0 or down to baseline over here. And then after a certain point, you're just left with this period of stability where nothing's happening, right? The immune system isn't coming into attack. The brain isn't healing itself anymore. It's just nothing happening. And then the immune system comes back, and it attacks the brain some more. And then you're left with this increase in severity again. And then the immune system leaves, and then you're left with this decrease in severity, followed by another period of nothing happening. So what you can kind of see is a cycle, okay? You see a cycle in which at first the immune system attacks the brain, the symptoms flare up, and the brain collects more damage. We call this a relapse. And then you see a case where the immune system stops attacking so much, and the brain is allowed to heal itself. This is called a remission. And then you have this period of stability where nothing happens. So this is really why we call it relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis. Now the length in which these relapses and these remissions occur really varies. So it could be anywhere between a few days to a few years. Now, this is by far the most common form of MS. It affects about 80 to 85% of all multiple sclerosis cases. It typically affects women more than it affects men. And it usually starts pretty early in life, right? Usually when people are in their 20s. So if we take about 60 to 65% of all of those who have relapsing remitting MS, what we'll see is that later on in their life, these relapses and remissions will start to go away, and instead, we'll just see kind of a steady progression in the severity of the disease. So we'll just see here kind of this linear or this steady progression of the disease. So really, it's the immune system's kind of just hanging around over here. So the immune system is around here, and then it starts to really just chip away at the person's brain for really most likely the rest of their life. And so then we can mark this over here as a progression. So when this starts to happen, we say that the person has entered secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And like I mentioned earlier, this usually happens in about 60 to 65% of the people who had relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis. So why is it called secondary progressive? Well, it's progressive because the disease gets worse and worse steadily over time. And it's called secondary because this progressive phase happens after this relapsing and remitting phase. So, we have a secondary progressive MS. Is there a primary progressive MS? Well, yeah, there actually is one. And it's just simply called primary progressive multiple sclerosis. So primary progressive multiple sclerosis is actually pretty similar to secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, except instead of having these relapses and these remissions that happen early on, instead what's going to happen is you're going to start off with just this progressive increase. So we're just going to see kind of a linear increase in the severity of the disease. So the brain is just steadily taking more and more damage because the immune system is kind of just sticking around and attacking it. So we have this steady increase in damage. So primary progressive MS is actually pretty uncommon. It affects only about 10% of all the cases of MS. And because it only affects about 10% of all the cases, there aren't really that many treatment options available for it. At least not as many treatment options available for the relapsing remitting form. And also, unlike the relapsing remitting form, it affects men and women equally. And usually it starts a little bit later than the relapsing remitting form, usually about a decade later or so, in your 30s mostly. And so finally, there's actually one more form of multiple sclerosis, and it's actually the least common form of the disease. And we call it progressive relapsing multiple sclerosis. So remember you had that relapsing remitting form, and then you have both of those progressive forms. Progressive relapsing multiple sclerosis really takes the worst aspects of both of those. So maybe what you'll see is, maybe you'll start off having this kind of light inflammation over here. So maybe the disease will kind of start off progressively getting worse and worse. But then, all of a sudden, you'll see this kind of flare-up where you get a lot more immune cells that really begin to attack the brain. And when this happens, we enter a relapse. This can be followed by a remission, right? When all those immune cells kind of start to go away. But maybe there is some left over that'll continue this attack and kind of chip away at the brain. So unlike with our relapsing remitting form, right, over here, where it's just kind of plateaued, instead, the disease will now progressively just get worse and worse. And then you may see another relapse, right, followed by another remission, and then followed by, more progression. So really what we're seeing is kind of a combination of all these forms of multiple sclerosis in the form of progressive relapsing multiple sclerosis. So as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the least common form. It only affects about 5% of all cases. So overall, I've kind of shown you 4 different types of multiple sclerosis, right? And it's really important to kind of be aware of these 4 different types because when one is trying to diagnose the disease, they really need to be aware of, which type does this person have? So here I have a brain slice of someone who's looking at you, and you'll notice that there's kind of this exterior portion, and then there's this interior portion as well. And I've kind of color-coded both of them. We won't be focusing too much on this blue part right here. So this exterior part is what we call the gray matter, and this interior part is called the white matter. Now, of course, in this sketch, it's not actually gray and white, but if you look at a real brain, you'll notice that the exterior is kind of gray, and the interior is white. So what makes up the gray and white matter? Well, if you'll remember, the brain is made up of about 86 billion neurons. Those 86 billion neurons are going to compose the gray matter and the white matter. So let me actually draw a neuron over here. So here, we have the dendrites. Here we have the cell body. This is the axon, and this is the myelin. So you'll notice that I've kind of drawn the cell membrane in kind of the same color as this exterior. And the reason why I do that is because the cell membrane is what's going to give that gray matter its gray color. So the dendrites and the cell body kind of have this cell membrane, and that's really what gives the gray matter its color. Now the axon also has some cell membrane, but the axon also has myelin, and it's the myelin that's going to give the white matter its color. So the dendrites in the cell body are going to compose the gray matter, and the myelin that's wrapped around the axon is going to compose the white matter. So next, let's say that this person develops multiple sclerosis, and what we'll see are these lesions that kind of form throughout the white matter of the brain. That actually makes sense because in multiple sclerosis, the myelin that gives the white matter its color begins to degrade away. And the reason why it does that is because the immune system mistakenly recognizes the myelin as foreign and it attacks it. So how does the immune system actually make its way into the brain? Well, ordinarily the immune system travels through blood vessels. So the brain needs to receive a lot of nourishment from these blood vessels. And the immune system is actually going to travel through these blood vessels. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to zoom in on a segment of the brain. So let's take a look at this particular segment over here. So here we have our blood vessel. So with this blood vessel, we're actually going to have these cells that outline it called endothelial cells. These endothelial cells will be really holding on to each other really tightly here, like as if they're kind of holding hands really, really tightly. And these points where they really hold tightly are called tight junctions. And these endothelial cells are kind of sitting on this foundation, right? Kind of like the foundation of a house. So this red line that I've kind of drawn here, and we call this the basement membrane. Together, these will compose what's called the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier is a pretty special structure because it stops a lot of things from entering the brain, things that you really don't want to enter the brain. So, for example, let's say we have a virus, and we really don't want that virus to enter the brain because once it does, it'll start to do a lot of damage. So the blood-brain barrier is going to stop that from happening. It also stops your immune system from entering the brain. So, maybe you have like a T cell over here, which is one of your immune cells. So, let's say this is a T cell. It won't really be able to enter the brain, right? Usually the immune system has some pretty limited access to it. But in multiple sclerosis, these T cells are really able to squeeze past the endothelial cells and break through the basement membrane. And then that way, they can actually make their way into the brain. And so now they really have access to a lot of the brain. And this is pretty bad, right? Because this is actually an unfamiliar environment for that T cell, because it usually shouldn't be there. Now remember, in your brain you have a whole bunch of neurons, right? So let me actually draw another neuron over here. So you have the myelin over here, and myelin has some pretty distinctive features on it, right? So it's going to have some proteins that may kind of be at the surface of the myelin. The T cell may go to that protein and recognize it and say, hey, this for some reason doesn't look good. For some reason this looks foreign, and I think that we should start to attack it. And of course it's mistaken because, it thinks that it's foreign, but in reality it's part of the body. So once the T cell kind of recognizes that part of the myelin, it'll start to go haywire. It'll kind of set off this alarm. So what it'll do is it's going to release these chemicals called cytokines. And cytokines are going to do a lot of different things. One thing they can do is they can promote the degradation of the blood-brain barrier. So now the blood-brain barrier becomes a lot more permeable to a lot more cells, right? So now some more T cells can come in. The cytokines can also recruit other immune cells. So maybe we have a B cell over here. So here's a B cell. It's now able to enter the blood-brain barrier. And so now all of a sudden you have these B cells in here, and they're going to make these antibodies for the myelin. And once they make the antibodies for the myelin, it's going to target that myelin for further degradation. And then you may also even have some macrophages. And the macrophages are really going to eat up that myelin and really physically degrade it. And then finally, those cytokines can actually be toxic to the myelin as well. So the cytokines can themselves degrade all that myelin. So now what you have is just a whole bunch of degraded myelin. So now we have a whole bunch of immune cells that are really clustered around a part of the brain. And when this happens, we call this neuro inflammation. So this is pretty bad, right? But as it turns out, the brain actually does have a way of repairing itself. So how does it do that? Well, let's say we have another neuron over here. So that myelin is actually going to be provided for the neurons by these cells over here. These cells are not neurons. In fact, they're called oligodendrocytes. And when that myelin is degraded away, this oligodendrocyte will begin the process of remyelination. So it's going to try to repair all that damaged myelin. And so this is great, right? This means that the brain has a natural healing process. And we call that remyelination. But as time goes on, that remyelination actually becomes less and less effective. So the oligodendrocyte will really try to remyelinate the axon to the best of its abilities, but it'll ultimately just become overwhelmed by the power of the immune system. And the immune system will be really persistent, right? These T cells will just constantly release all these cytokines. Those B cells will always be around to release those antibodies, and the macrophages will always be around to actually phagocytize that myelin. So ultimately what we have is this remyelination process that's being overpowered by the immune system. Let's say you are a clinician and you want to tell if someone has multiple sclerosis. One of the first things you might do is you might actually look into their brain. And the way to do this is to use a technique called magnetic resonance imaging, otherwise known as MRI. So what you do is you have someone lay down on this bed, and they enter this kind of cramped and really loud machine over here. And that machine is actually going to take pictures of their brain. Interestingly enough, it's actually going to take pictures from 3 different perspectives. So on the left, we kind of have a picture of someone who looks like they're looking towards the left. This slice of the brain is called a sagittal slice. In the middle, it looks like we have a slice of someone who's looking in this direction. So it's kind of as if we're looking down from the top of their head. And we call this a horizontal slice. And on the far right, we have a slice of someone who looks as though they're looking towards or away from you. And we call this a coronal slice. In all 3 slices, you'll see one thing that's common. They have these bright spots over here, right? So these bright spots that they actually point out. And these bright spots are referred to as lesions. A lesion is just a piece of damaged tissue. So if you think someone has multiple sclerosis and you have all these brain scans, the first thing you're going to look for are these bright spots here. These bright spots are actually located wherever there is white matter. And remember that the white matter is really just the axons and the myelin of your neurons. So this is informative, right? You see that you have damage in the brain, but that damage could result from anything. So we haven't really narrowed it down specifically. We can still do a few more tests to really confirm that this is multiple sclerosis. So we can actually do something that is a little bit more invasive. So here I have a picture of someone's lower back. And in purple here is the person's spinal cord. You'll see this kind of blue stuff that's surrounding the spinal cord, and that stuff is just called your cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid just bathes both the spine and your brain. It contains all sorts of good things like proteins and ions and all sorts of things that you need for the brain and spinal cord to work. So what we can do is we can actually extract that cerebrospinal fluid using this needle, and we can collect it into this vial. So now we have a vial, and that vial has a whole bunch of cerebrospinal fluid. But the question is, what is in that cerebrospinal fluid? There's going to be something in here that's characteristic of multiple sclerosis. So what is that thing? Well, remember that multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. So the immune system is really crossing paths with the nervous system. So we want to see something that's characteristic of the immune system. So maybe if we kind of zoom in here. So what's characteristic of the immune system? Well, antibodies. If you have a lot of antibodies in your cerebrospinal fluid, then that may indicate that your immune system is in the central nervous system. So how do we determine if there are antibodies in here? We can use a technique known as gel electrophoresis. So I'll spare you the details of how exactly this technique works. But really what it does is first it separates the contents in your sample, and it allows us to visualize those contents. So basically, we're going to send this vial off to a lab, and they're going to perform gel electrophoresis. And when you separate the contents of the cerebrospinal fluid, and when you visualize it, it looks something like this. So here I kind of have 2 different strips for you. The left strip corresponds to a person who is healthy, and the right strip corresponds to someone who has multiple sclerosis. So immediately, you'll notice that there are these white bands over here, and these bands are going to correspond to different proteins. In the healthy sample, you'll notice that these bands are separated uniformly. But in the multiple sclerosis sample, you'll see that there are these thicker bands over here. And these thicker bands are referred to as oligoclonal bands. When you see these oligoclonal bands, that's actually pretty indicative that there are a lot of antibodies in the sample. Because you have a lot of antibodies in the sample, that means you have a lot of antibodies in your cerebrospinal fluid. That tells us that the immune system is really, really active in the central nervous system. So we have two pieces of evidence, right? We have pictures of the brain that showed the lesions, and we have evidence that shows that the immune system is involved in the central nervous system. But there's still one more test that we can do to definitively say that this person has multiple sclerosis. We can actually measure the electrical activity in the person's brain. So let's say you have a person here and he's just sitting in a dark room, and you put these electrodes here onto their scalp. Those electrodes are going to measure their brain activity. More specifically, it's going to measure the brain's response to some kind of visual stimulus. In this case, it's a computer screen. On your computer screen, you have a checkerboard. So you have all these black tiles and you have all these white tiles. And these tiles are actually going to alternate every half second or so. So maybe every half second or so, all the black tiles will now appear white and all the white tiles will now appear black. And it's just going to alternate back and forth. So we're basically measuring the brain's response to this visual stimulus. And that response is going to be called a visual evoked potential. So what are we measuring here? Well, we're measuring an electrical response. And we're going to measure it graphically. So let's say we have a graph over here. On the x-axis is time, usually on the scale of milliseconds. And on the y-axis we have voltage, usually on the scale of microvolts. So let's say, we're kind of measuring the person's brain activity. And at some point the checkerboard alternates, and you're going to see this kind of peak in the voltage. And then it's going to go back down and then continue onwards. So we're going to be looking at these peaks, right, in response to the alternating checkerboard. So usually you collect data from a lot of peaks, right, but this is just one such example. Now, given that this is a visual evoked potential, you're going to be measuring activity from visual areas in the brain. So let's say, you have your eyes over here. So this is the person's eyes. At the back of the eyes are the optic nerves. The optic nerves will carry visual information in the form of electrical activity to the rest of the brain. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this person has a lesion in their left optic nerve. Their right optic nerve, however, is perfectly healthy. So when we measure the electrical activity from both of the optic nerves, we can actually compare them. We can compare activity from the healthy optic nerve to activity from the damaged optic nerve. So let's say that the graph that I've drawn here, right, as it is now, is just the optic nerve that's healthy. So it's the right optic nerve. And then you look at the electrical activity from the left optic nerve. It might look like something like this. Immediately, you can tell that there is actually a delay between the two. It took a longer period of time for the left optic nerve to respond to the alternating checkerboard. This actually makes a lot of sense, because if we think back to it, let's say we have a neuron over here. Ordinarily, your neurons have a bunch of myelin that insulate their axons, and this myelin helps the electrical signals travel down a lot more quickly on the axon. But in multiple sclerosis, that myelin gets degraded. When that myelin is degraded, the signal that moves down the axon is a lot slower. So when you have all this degraded myelin over here on the left optic nerve, it makes a lot of sense for the signal to be slightly delayed. Now I want to make it clear that these signals that I've drawn here aren't actually action potentials. They're signals that you get from the overall nerve. But in general, the principle is still the same. You see this delay in the response. So the left optic nerve is now slower than the right optic nerve because you have this lesion over here. So all in all, I've shown you 3 very common tests that people use when diagnosing multiple sclerosis. So we know that in multiple sclerosis, the immune system is attacking the central nervous system. But we don't really know why it's doing that. So in other words, we don't really know what the true cause of the disease is. Because we don't know the true cause of the disease, there is no known cure for it. However, there are a lot of treatment options available for people. A really common class of drugs that people take are the disease-modifying drugs. So how do these act? Well, remember that in multiple sclerosis, we can really track the way that the disease progresses over time. So on the x-axis we have time, right, in terms of the lifespan of the individual. And on the y-axis we have the severity of the disease, that is, how much damage does the brain accumulate. There are 4 different types of multiple sclerosis, each characterized by the way that they progress over time. The most common type is the relapsing remitting form. So you can tell here, there's a relapse over here, and a relapse is really when the brain starts to accumulate a lot of damage and the symptoms start to flare up and the severity increases. And you have a remission over here. This is when the brain kind of starts to heal itself and the symptoms go away for a bit and the disease itself starts to improve. This type affects about 80 to 85% of those who have multiple sclerosis. Because it's so common, most of the treatment options that we have, right, those disease-modifying drugs, address this type. There are other types of multiple sclerosis, but unfortunately they don't really respond well to these drugs. So what are these disease-modifying drugs going to do? well, they're actually going to modify the course at which this disease progresses. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take these drugs, then it's most likely that the graph will probably look something like this instead. So you can already tell some of the major differences, right? One, that the severity of these relapses is decreased. And two, the remission time has also increased. So what you're doing is you're slowing the progression of the disease. That's why we call them disease-modifying drugs, because they modify the progression of the disease. So what are some disease-modifying drugs? Well, most of them are immunosuppressants. And I think this word is actually pretty self-explanatory. These guys are going to suppress the immune system. So one example of an immunosuppressant are the corticosteroids. These are steroid hormones that are actually released by the adrenal glands above your kidneys. But they can also be given to a person as medication. And then you also have the beta interferons. So an interferon is a chemical that's released by the immune system to manage inflammation. A beta interferon will suppress the inflammation. So how do these work? What's going on at the cellular level? Well, we kind of have to understand the pathophysiology, right? So let's say we have a neuron over here. As usual, this neuron will have myelin surrounding the axon. And then next to this neuron, you may have a blood vessel. Around this blood vessel is a kind of a wall, right, known as the blood-brain barrier. This blood-brain barrier is going to stop immune cells like this T cell over here from crossing over and entering the brain. So this guy is ordinarily trapped in the blood vessel. But in multiple sclerosis, this blood-brain barrier becomes pretty leaky, and this guy is able to make his way across. This is actually one of the first points in which these immunosuppressants can act. They can actually stop that T cell from crossing the blood-brain barrier, and in doing so, he's not even going to interact with the brain at all to begin with. So now the immune system has limited access to the brain. But this isn't the only site where the immunosuppressants can act. So maybe the T cell actually manages to make his way across the blood-brain barrier. The T cell will look at that myelin and it'll recognize it as foreign. In doing so, this will trigger an alarm. So this T cell is going to release a whole bunch of chemicals called cytokines. These cytokines are going to alert a whole bunch of other immune cells. So maybe you have a B cell over here that responds to those cytokines, or maybe even a macrophage. And this will lead to inflammation. But one thing your immunosuppressants can do is they can ensure that the T cell doesn't react so vigorously to the myelin. If it doesn't react as much, it may not release so many cytokines. If it doesn't release as many cytokines, then those cytokines won't really be able to recruit the other cells of the immune system. So ultimately what we have is a dampened immune response. The immune system isn't really able to act as vigorously and as aggressively anymore. So of course these disease-modifying drugs will kind of relieve some of those symptoms, but they do so by addressing the pathophysiology. But there are alternative ways to really address those symptoms. So what we want to do is we want to think of different types of symptom management. So instead of kind of just taking those medicines, you can also do a number of other alternative things to really address those symptoms directly. So let's say we have a person over here, and let's say this person has multiple sclerosis. What are the symptoms they may experience? Well, one, they may have a lot of fatigue, right? So they may just be really physically exhausted all the time. In addition to that, they may also have this stiffness of their muscles, where their muscles are contracting too much. And this can lead to a lot of pain. They may also have muscle weakness and numbness in their arms. So these are a lot of symptoms, right? So how do we address them? Well, we can have the person visit a physical therapist. So here we have a physical therapist. And really what they're going to do is they're going to have this person perform a number of different physical tasks. Maybe they'll help them do some stretching exercises. Maybe they'll help them walk a little bit more normally. And ultimately, this will kind of help relieve those symptoms. But there are still other symptoms that maybe a physical therapist might not be able to help out with. So remember that in multiple sclerosis, a lot of people may actually experience cognitive dysfunction. And just as a brief review, remember that cognition includes functions like attention, working memory, and decision-making. These functions can be pretty heavily impaired in multiple sclerosis. And this can be really problematic because cognitive dysfunction is really one of the major reasons why people have to leave their jobs. So how can we address this? Well, we can have the person undergo what's called cognitive rehabilitation therapy. So in cognitive rehabilitation therapy, the primary goal is to kind of restore these functions. And the way to do that is to have the person perform a set of mental tasks. Right? So they may play a few games where they try to remember a few things and all sorts of things that will really help them kind of strengthen their cognitive abilities. And in doing so, their cognition will start to improve. Right? So it's kind of like physical therapy, except instead of working with your body, you're working with your mind. So these are some of the alternative ways to manage your symptoms without taking those disease-modifying drugs.